On the morning of December 5, 1945, the sky above Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was crisp and clear. It was a day that started like countless others at the Naval Air Station. Ground crews moved between rows of parked aircraft, checking engines and fueling lines while a few trainees gathered in the briefing room, some sipping coffee from metal mugs, others nervously reviewing flight maps. At 10 a.m., a tall man in a khaki flight suit stepped inside the room. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, aged 28, was to command a routine navigation and bombing drill that afternoon. Though a seasoned pilot with more than 2,500 flight hours, Taylor looked tired. His eyes were slightly bloodshot, and his uniform appeared hastily thrown on. He had just returned from a weekend leave and had requested not to lead the day's training flight, citing personal fatigue. But staffing was short, and the request had been denied. The mission was straightforward. Known as Navigation Problem Number 1, the flight would consist of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, manned by a total of 14 crew members. The trainees had flown this exact pattern several times before. The route would take them east from the base to Hens and Chickens Shoals for a practice bombing run, then north toward Grand Bahama Island, and finally back southwest to Fort Lauderdale. It was designed to reinforce basic overwater navigation skills, particularly using dead reckoning, estimating position based on time, speed, and direction, rather than visual landmarks. The 5 planes, designated FT-28 through FT-36, were lined up on the tarmac, shimmering under the Florida sun. Ground crews made final checks as the air buzzed with the whine of turning propellers. Lieutenant Taylor climbed into the cockpit of FT-28, flanked by 2 younger men, Ensign George Devlin and radioman James Powers, both eager to be in the sky. In the neighboring aircraft, similar teams settled into their positions. There was plane FT-81, crewed by Ensign Joseph Bossetti and Sergeant Walter Parshley. F-117 had Ensign William Lightfoot and radioman Robert Gallagher. F-3 included Ensign Edward Warby and Gunner John Stivers. And in FT-36, pilot Frank Lombardo flew with crewman Ralph Bruning and Alan Willard. By 2:10 p.m., all 5 aircraft lifted from the runway in tight formation. Their silver fuselages gleamed against the pale blue sky as they climbed eastward toward the Atlantic Ocean. From the ground, it looked like a ballet of war machines, precise, powerful, and well-rehearsed. For the first 45 minutes, all went smoothly. Flight 19 reached Hens and Chickens Shoals around 2:50 p.m. and dropped their practice bombs, watched carefully by a patrol boat stationed nearby to score their accuracy. The trainees maintained radio discipline, responding to Taylor's commands crisply. From above, the ocean below shimmered in turquoise and deep blue tones, calm and unthreatening. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Flight 19 completed their bombing run and turned northeast for the second leg of the triangle. That's when the first sign of trouble surfaced. Lieutenant Taylor's voice came over the radio, static-laced but audible. "This is FT-28. My compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm over land, but I'm not sure where." Lieutenant Robert Cox, a senior flight instructor who was also airborne that afternoon on a separate training run, picked up the transmission. He responded calmly, asking Taylor to describe what he saw. Taylor answered hesitantly, "I'm over Broken Islands. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." Cox knew immediately something was wrong. If Taylor was over the Keys and thought he had flown east from the base, he had to be disoriented. The Keys were far to the south. Flight 19 should have been northeast, near Grand Bahama. But Taylor insisted he recognized the islands. Cox urged Taylor to fly north, then west toward the setting sun. That would bring them back toward the Florida coast. But Taylor's replies grew more uncertain. "Everything looks strange, even the ocean. It doesn't look like it should." In the background, the voices of his trainees could be heard, some panicked, others trying to stay calm. One young voice cut through. "If we would just fly west, we'd get home." But Taylor, confused and doubting himself, ordered the flight to turn northeast, away from the coast, deeper into the Atlantic. Back at the Naval Air Station, ground controllers were picking up the erratic transmissions and growing increasingly alarmed. Attempts to triangulate Flight 19's position were hampered by static and conflicting reports. Some signals suggested they were east of Florida, others far to the north. The cloud cover began to thicken, and daylight started to fade. Ground stations lost and regained contact with the flight sporadically. Taylor's voice grew more distant and garbled. At one point he radioed, "We're not certain where we are." Repeat, "We're not certain." Static interrupted the sentence. By 4:30 p.m., panic had begun to set in among the men of Flight 19. Their fuel levels were dropping. The bombers had large fuel tanks, but they'd now been in the air for over 2 hours with no clear direction home. Taylor radioed, "We'll have to ditch soon if we don't find land." The ocean had turned from calm to turbulent, with gusty winds and building waves. The idea of ditching 5 aircraft at sea, with 14 young men on board, was chilling. The TBM Avengers were strong, but they weren't designed for sea landings. The Naval Air Station ordered a massive search effort to begin immediately. Aircraft and rescue ships were dispatched from nearby bases. The first to respond was a Martin PBM Mariner, a flying boat with a crew of 13. It launched at 7:27 p.m. from Banana River Naval Air Station, heading toward Flight 19's last known position. 20 minutes later, the PBM disappeared from radar. Witnesses aboard a nearby tanker reported seeing an explosion in the sky and flames on the water. An oil slick was later discovered at the site, but no wreckage, no bodies, nothing. Now, Flight 19 and one of their rescuers were missing. The scale of the response grew exponentially overnight. Dozens of aircraft took to the skies. Navy ships crisscrossed the ocean, forming search grids. The Coast Guard and even civilian fishing boats joined the effort. The ocean was scoured in every direction for hundreds of miles. Planes flew in low formation, dipping down to search for any sign of life rafts, debris, or flares. Underwater sonar scanned for wreckage, but the ocean kept its secrets. Days passed. On land, families gathered at naval offices, desperate for information. Mothers clutched photos, wives paced waiting rooms, and fathers asked the same questions over and over. What happened? Where did they go? Why weren't they found? The answers never came. Investigators pored over the final transmissions. They listened to the tapes repeatedly, trying to discern patterns. Some began to believe Taylor's compass had malfunctioned entirely, and that he had flown the group far east, mistaking the Bahamas for the Keys. Others theorized a sudden weather anomaly may have disoriented them. But nothing explained the complete disappearance. No distress beacons, no debris, no emergency signals. And nothing explained why a massive rescue aircraft would vanish just the same way. Back at Fort Lauderdale, one of Taylor's fellow instructors, Lieutenant Henry Kirk, reflected on his friend's last mission. Charles was a good man, a sharp pilot. But that day, something had him rattled. I don't know what it was. Maybe something he saw or felt. But he wasn't himself. The Navy initially released a report blaming Taylor for the loss of the flight. It cited navigational error and pilot confusion. But weeks later, after complaints from Taylor's family and pressure from within the military, the report was amended. The official cause of the disappearance was changed to cause unknown. It was an unusual move for the Navy and only added to the mystery. The story soon became national news. Headlines read "Flight Lost in Bermuda Triangle" and "Ghost Planes Vanish Without Trace." Though the term Bermuda Triangle wasn't yet commonly used, the myth was already forming. People speculated wildly. Was it aliens? A government cover-up? A natural anomaly? The region had a long history of strange disappearances, ships vanishing, compasses spinning, radios going silent. As the search efforts wound down after 5 days, families were left with nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no answers. Just silence and a void where their sons, brothers, husbands once were. A memorial was erected in Fort Lauderdale with the names of all 14 men on Flight 19 and the 13 lost in the PBM Mariner. It reads simply, "They are not lost. They fly in another sky." Decades later, deep-sea researchers uncovered the wrecks of several TBM Avengers off the Florida coast. For a moment, the world held its breath. Was this Flight 19? But the serial numbers didn't match. These planes had gone down during other training runs. The trail went cold again. What happened that afternoon remains one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. 14 young men, 5 powerful aircraft, and a routine mission that became legend. The vanishing of Flight 19. Lost in the Bermuda Triangle. By the time the sun rose on December 6th, the Atlantic Ocean was alive with activity. More than 24 naval vessels formed search grids across the waves while aircraft zigzagged overhead. It was the largest peacetime air-sea rescue operation in American history at that point. For every hour that passed, the reality became harder to deny. Flight 19 was gone, truly gone. The sea, it seemed, had devoured it whole. Lieutenant Commander John Marks, who led one of the search squadrons, found himself staring out over the waves from the deck of the USS Solace, scanning the horizon with a pair of binoculars as if sheer willpower might summon a wingtip or floating vest. Every 10 minutes, he repeated the same question to his radio man. "Any new signals?" Every time the answer came back the same. "Negative, sir." The men aboard the ships spoke in hushed tones when they discussed the missing planes. Something about it all felt off. Everyone agreed that yes, accidents happened, especially in aviation training. But 5 planes vanishing in formation, followed by a rescue plane disappearing without so much as a distress call? That was more than accident. That was something else. At the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, family members had begun arriving. Wives clutched babies. Mothers wore coats too light for the wind. Fathers kept their arms crossed tight across their chests. They stared at the hangar where the planes should have returned and tried to make sense of absence. One woman, Eleanor Bruning, wife of Ralph Bruning from FT-36, asked a young officer how much gas the planes carried. When he told her, "Enough for 5 hours, she did the math and muttered, "Then he's been gone too long." No one had the heart to answer her. Meanwhile, a young journalist named Peter Langston from the Miami Herald began digging through archived reports of other disappearances in the same region. He discovered, to his shock, a long list of strange incidents. Entire schooners that vanished in fair weather. Planes that departed from Cuba and were never heard from again. Fishing boats whose compasses spun in circles until their radios went silent. He pitched his editor on a story titled The Devil's Triangle, but the editor laughed it off as too dramatic. Still, the phrase stayed with Peter, and he kept his notes. While the public tried to move on, military intelligence wasn't so quick to let it go. Quietly, a classified investigation was launched into Flight 19, this time not to assign blame, but to understand. They reviewed the transmissions, the timing, the fuel capacities, and the magnetic field readings in that region of the Atlantic. A few strange findings emerged. 1. The last known position of Flight 19, based on triangulated radio signals, placed them over open water hundreds of miles east of where Taylor had believed he was. 2. Atmospheric interference had been unusually high that day, confirmed by weather balloons and radio towers up and down the coast. 3. Compass data from several other planes flying that day showed irregular readings near a point approximately 100 miles northeast of the Bahamas. One Navy analyst, Commander Ira Bennett, proposed that a localized geomagnetic storm may have caused instrument failure. But that didn't explain the voices. Taylor and his crew had described visual confusion, the ocean looking strange, the sky darkening fast. "Even the ocean doesn't look like it should," Taylor had said. That wasn't a compass error. That was something else. In the months that followed, letters poured into Navy offices from people across the country. Some claimed to have seen strange lights over the sea that night. Others said they heard ghostly plane engines above their homes, long after the aircraft should have run out of fuel. A woman in Charleston swore a plane circled her house at midnight, so low the windows rattled, but there was nothing on radar. These accounts were dismissed, logged as civilian hysteria. But they kept coming. The men of Flight 19 began to take on a ghost-like presence in the national imagination. They were no longer just names, they were symbols. Symbols of the unknown. Of what happens when routine collides with mystery. Of what lies out there beyond what we can track and measure. Years passed. The ocean kept its silence. But the story refused to fade. In 1951, an author named Vincent Gaddis wrote an article for Argosy magazine titled, "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle." He mentioned Flight 19 in the opening paragraph, framing it as one of the most inexplicable events in modern aviation. Gaddis wasn't a military expert or a pilot. He was a writer with a flair for the eerie. But he tapped into something powerful. The story resonated not just because it was strange, but because it had happened to ordinary men on a routine day. In 1952, a retired Navy radar technician named Harold Lawson, who had monitored East Coast frequencies the day of the disappearance, spoke anonymously to a small radio station in Georgia. He said that around 6:15 p.m. on December 5th, he had detected a ping from an unknown source, something large stationary, hovering at 20,000 feet. It vanished minutes later. The Navy never acknowledged the claim. Lawson died in 1964, but a written transcript of his interview surfaced years later, sparking renewed interest. Meanwhile, the ocean did give up some secrets, just not the ones people wanted. In 1965, a fishing trawler pulled up part of a rusted wing off the coast of Andros Island. Serial numbers confirmed it wasn't from Flight 19. In 1973, a scuba team found what they believed to be a TBM Avenger 80 feet beneath the waves near Bermuda. But corrosion and marine growth made identification impossible. And still, the core question echoed unanswered. How could 5 planes and a rescue crew vanish without a trace, not one single life vest or signal flare found? In 1981, a strange man appeared at a veterans reunion in Jacksonville. He was elderly, walked with a cane, and wore a faded Navy cap with the insignia for Torpedo Squadron 49. He introduced himself only as Tom, and claimed to have flown with Charles Taylor before the war ended. He said Taylor had once spoken of a place in the ocean that changed shape when you got close. Tom told the gathered men that Taylor had been nervous in the days before the flight, had mentioned bad dreams and a strange hum in his ears. Before anyone could ask more, Tom disappeared from the event and was never seen again. The families of the Flight 19 crew continued to push for recognition. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, a memorial service was held at Fort Lauderdale. A bell was rung 14 times, once for each man. Among the attendees was Daniel Lombardo, the younger brother of Frank Lombardo, who had piloted FT-36. Daniel was just 12 when his brother vanished. At the memorial, now in his 60s, he spoke into a microphone, his voice trembling. "Frank was a good man. Brave pilot. I don't know where he is now, but I hope he knows we didn't forget him." By the 2000s, digital sonar and GPS mapping had transformed undersea search. A new wave of efforts began, including deep-sea drones, satellite-based imaging, and magnetic anomaly detection. A few more plane wrecks were found scattered across the seabed. Each one examined meticulously. Each time disappointment. None of them matched Flight 19. What remained wasn't evidence. It was feeling. An ache in the bones of the story. A sense that the answers weren't buried in the sea, but somewhere else. That maybe, just maybe, Flight 19 didn't crash in the traditional sense. That maybe the world isn't as fixed as we think. Some fringe theorists began to float bizarre ideas. That the planes entered a time rift. That a wormhole opened in the clouds. That alien interference scrambled their reality. These theories were mocked, but their persistence says something about human nature. When faced with true mystery, the imagination doesn't just wander, it flies. And then, in 2004, something strange happened. A commercial cargo pilot flying a Learjet from Nassau to Miami encountered radio interference just 20 minutes into his flight. His instruments flickered. His compass spun wildly. The sky turned an unnatural shade of violet, and the ocean below took on a metallic sheen. For 30 seconds everything went dead. No radar. No altitude readings. Then, just as suddenly, everything returned to normal. The pilot reported the incident. It was logged as electrical anomaly due to high-altitude static charge. But in his personal notes, he wrote something else. One word. Triangle. The legend of Flight 19 had come full circle. What began as a military training mission had become folklore, had become myth, and then, decades later, started whispering again in static and shadow. They say if you fly too far into the Bermuda Triangle, the ocean stops obeying the rules. The sky folds in strange ways. Time gets soft. And the voices of lost pilots ride the wind like echoes. Whether or not you believe it, Flight 19 is still out there. Somewhere. Waiting. In the years following the disappearance of Flight 19, the waters east of Florida seemed to take on a new identity. They became the embodiment of fear, not because they were stormy or impassable, but because of what they swallowed. To those who worked in aviation and maritime circles, the region came to be spoken of with a mixture of reverence and unease. Pilots double-checked their instruments more often when flying over it. Ship captains radioed more frequently when crossing through. But most of all, they paid attention to their gut feelings. Those feelings weren't scientific, but neither were the disappearances. By the mid-2000s, several independent research groups had taken interest in solving the mystery once and for all. One such group was the Horizon Deep Research Initiative, based out of Charleston, South Carolina. Headed by a retired naval engineer named Dr. Thomas Rourke, the team was equipped with advanced sonar technology, remotely operated vehicles, and access to recently declassified naval records. Rourke had spent the better part of his adult life fascinated by unexplained aviation incidents, and Flight 19 was his white whale. He didn't believe in aliens or time rifts, but he was convinced there had to be a rational explanation buried somewhere beneath the waves. In the summer of 2006, his team launched an expedition 160 miles east of Fort Lauderdale, targeting a stretch of ocean where anomalous sonar readings had been picked up. They deployed a submersible drone named Nereus, outfitted with high-resolution cameras and magnetic sensors. For the first 2 days, the expedition was uneventful. The seabed was largely barren, scattered with coral, rusted anchors, and the occasional skeleton of a long-lost ship. But on the third night something changed. Around 2:17 a.m., Nereus detected a massive magnetic pulse, a burst of energy so strong it briefly knocked out the feed between the drone and the research vessel above. When the link was re-established, the drone's instruments were scrambled. Its compass was spinning uncontrollably. Internal gyros failed. The drone had lost orientation. What was strange, though, was what the camera picked up just before the glitch. A structure, part of an aircraft fuselage, its surface covered in marine growth but unmistakably metallic. The serial markings were unreadable, but its design closely resembled the TBM Avenger. The footage only lasted 8 seconds before the signal cut completely. The team attempted to retrieve Nereus, but contact had been lost. They never recovered it. The incident was logged as a technical malfunction due to electromagnetic interference. But to Dr. Rourke, it was confirmation that they had been closer than anyone in decades. That same year, a journalist named Laura Green began digging into a previously overlooked detail about Lieutenant Charles Taylor's background. A series of letters between Taylor and his mother, recovered from a dusty box in a Florida archive, revealed something curious. Taylor had reportedly suffered multiple bouts of disorientation during training flights in the Pacific Theater, often reporting feelings of detachment or spatial confusion. One letter mentioned an incident in early 1944 where Taylor radioed his base claiming the ocean had folded below him and that he was flying in circles that didn't exist. The incident was dismissed at the time and attributed to pilot fatigue. But the language matched disturbingly well with what he said during Flight 19. Even more compelling, one letter written by Taylor just 4 days before the Flight 19 mission contained an eerie sentence. "Sometimes I dream of being caught in the clouds, and when I wake, I feel like part of me is still there." It was poetic but unsettling. Laura's article was published in a national magazine and reignited public interest in the case. The idea that Taylor may have experienced something paranormal or psychological added new dimension to the mystery. Still, many refused to accept that this was anything more than a tragic accident compounded by navigational errors. Skeptics pointed to the fact that most disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle occurred along heavily trafficked routes. The more planes and ships pass through, the more likely accidents will happen. Weather conditions can change rapidly in the Atlantic. Water currents move debris. It was all explainable on paper. But there was always a lingering detail that statistics couldn't explain: the consistency. In each story, something interfered with instruments. Something disrupted communication. Something made experienced pilots and sailors question their senses. That pattern was what troubled even the most grounded investigators. One of those investigators was Captain Daniel Harkness, a now retired Navy pilot who had spent 2 decades flying over the Atlantic. In a 2010 interview, he admitted that he had once experienced an unexplainable event while flying a routine logistics mission from Puerto Rico to Norfolk. About halfway through, his instruments went dead for exactly 3 minutes. No GPS. No altimeter. Even the artificial horizon stopped responding. It was like being blind, he said. The strangest part was the silence. No wind, no engine whine. Just this complete stillness inside the cabin. When the systems came back, he was 30 miles off course. He reported the incident, but nothing came of it. You learn not to talk too much about those things, he said. It makes people uncomfortable. In 2015, a major development occurred. A salvage company working near the Bahamas for unrelated reasons discovered multiple aircraft debris sites in a tight cluster on the ocean floor. Among the wreckage were propeller parts, a wing section, and a partially intact instrument panel. Initial assessments suggested it could be one of the Avengers from Flight 19. The serial numbers, however, were again inconclusive. Marine corrosion had obliterated most identifying marks. Still, photographs of the site went viral. The public latched on to the images, convinced that the truth was finally at hand. But without confirmation, the discovery faded from headlines within weeks. The mystery of Flight 19 wasn't just about planes or coordinates or weather patterns. It was about memory, about how history holds on to some things while letting others slip away. Every December 5th, aviation forums lit up with tributes. Documentaries re-aired. Families of the lost gathered at the memorial at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, placing wreaths beside the marble monument. And every year, the questions remained the same. How does a group of experienced aviators vanish so thoroughly? Why did a rescue plane disappear under the same conditions? And why has no part of them ever washed ashore? In 2020, a curious theory began circulating online, one that suggested Flight 19 may not have crashed at all, not in the traditional sense. The theory proposed that the flight may have entered a time slip, a moment where time and space distort, allowing entry into a parallel environment. The concept, known as chronodisplacement, wasn't mainstream science. But the internet has never needed consensus to spread an idea. A podcast called Skyfall Radio featured a 3-part series on the idea. In one episode, they played back old audio from Flight 19, restored from Navy archives, layered with modern instrument analysis. One particular phrase stood out. A young voice, likely one of the trainees, says faintly, "It's all the same direction, sir. Every way looks the same." The host of the show pauses the recording and whispers, "What if he meant time? It's speculative, maybe even absurd." But it highlights something important. Flight 19 haunts people not because it's unsolved, but because it resists being solved. It's a story that doesn't end. Not in the ocean. Not in reports. Not in sonar scans. And so it lives on. Somewhere in the quiet between the waves. Somewhere in the static between transmissions. The ocean keeps its secrets well. But the air. Sometimes the air still remembers. By the year 2022, the story of Flight 19 had transformed from a Cold War-era aviation mystery into something bordering myth. While a new generation of skeptics dismissed it as little more than a chain of tragic errors, others were drawn to its chilling consistency. The strange radio messages, the malfunctioning instruments, the rescue plane that vanished trying to find them. But for one man, it wasn't just a story. It was a legacy he couldn't escape. That man was Ryan Taylor, the great-nephew of Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Ryan had never known his great-uncle personally. He was born decades after the disappearance. But the stories had lingered in his family like smoke in the walls, unspoken yet always present. As a child, he would find his grandfather sitting quietly on the back porch, eyes fixed toward the southeast, where the horizon dipped over the Atlantic. Whenever Ryan asked about the flight, his grandfather would shake his head and say, "Charlie didn't crash. He just kept flying." It was cryptic, almost poetic. But it left an impression. After serving 4 years in the Air Force, Ryan pursued a degree in aeronautical engineering. He had a sharp mind for structure and failure analysis. But in the back of his thoughts, Flight 19 always hovered. When he graduated, he applied for a civilian post at NASA, but instead found himself joining a private aerospace research company in Jacksonville called Ionistech, a firm that specialized in electromagnetic studies and atmospheric anomalies. His work was largely technical, building sensor packages for weather balloons and designing fail-safes for drone navigation systems. But in late 2023, he pitched an idea to his supervisors. What if they could model the conditions from December 5, 1945, using modern meteorological data and virtual environment simulations? What if they could recreate Flight 19's path, not just in maps, but in real-time augmented data flows? The company wasn't particularly interested in chasing ghosts, but they were very interested in refining their simulation systems. So Ryan was given limited access to archived military flight data, weather models, and old naval logs. What began as a pet project quickly took over his evenings. He fed the data into the system one line at a time. Barometric pressure, wind patterns, ocean temperatures, even solar flare activity. On a quiet Friday night in March of 2024, the simulation produced an anomaly. At 15:47 Eastern Standard Time, when Taylor first reported his compasses had failed, the model predicted a high-energy electromagnetic field forming over a 20-mile radius, centered near the Bahamas. Ryan initially suspected a data corruption issue, but when he adjusted the input slightly, the anomaly remained. It wasn't weather. It wasn't radio interference. It was something else, something with no clear source. He ran the simulation 5 more times, adjusting the variables. The anomaly always returned. Not always in the same spot, but always around the same time and location. Pulsed like a heartbeat. Ryan reported his findings, but his supervisor brushed it off, saying it was likely a glitch caused by incomplete data from the 1940s. But Ryan didn't believe that. He knew glitches didn't show patterns. 2 weeks later, he received an email from a woman named Evelyn Marks. She introduced herself as a former NOAA researcher who had been following his work. She said she had come across his data models and believed he was on the right track. They agreed to meet at a cafe near the harbor. Evelyn was in her 60s, sharp-eyed, and cautious with her words. She carried a folder marked as 52. Inside were satellite images, printed maps, and 2 black and white photographs that had clearly been aged by time and humidity. One photo showed the surface of the ocean, ordinary, except for a faint swirl of mist or cloud just hovering above the waterline. Evelyn tapped it gently. This was taken by a weather buoy camera in 1987. It was never released to the public. The second photo was stranger. It looked like a sonar scan of the seabed, but the contours didn't make sense. The angles were too clean, too geometric. She said it was pulled from a classified Navy survey conducted in 2009. Officially, it was dismissed as equipment error. But Evelyn believed differently. She leaned in and whispered, "They found something down there. Something man didn't build." Ryan felt a chill settle in his chest. He asked her what she meant, but she only said, "You're not the only one chasing the ghosts." The more they spoke, the more he realized Evelyn had been conducting her own quiet investigation for years. She'd interviewed sailors who had seen lights under the water, pilots who had experienced momentary time loss over the triangle, even fishermen who claimed to hear voices coming from the deep. Most had been ridiculed or ignored. But the pattern was undeniable. Over the following months, Ryan and Evelyn pooled their resources. They mapped out dozens of disappearances stretching back a century. Ships, planes, even a small private submersible in 2011. Every case had at least one strange commonality. Either navigational instruments went dead, or communications ceased just before vanishing. Then came the recording. An anonymous source sent Ryan a digital audio file that claimed to be intercepted naval radio chatter from 1996, recorded by a now decommissioned listening station in Bermuda. In the clip, two voices argue over coordinates. One panicked voice insists they're flying west, even as their instruments show they're flying east. Then silence. A third voice cuts in, distorted and slow. Not mechanical, not human. Just one phrase. "You are not alone." Ryan couldn't verify the authenticity, but something about the recording felt real. Too raw to be faked. He kept playing it, trying to identify the voice. The file's metadata had no clues. But Evelyn thought the distortion was more than signal interference. She believed it was evidence of another frequency, a band of communication outside our standard range. Meanwhile, the military seemed to grow increasingly aware of their research. Ryan's laptop was hacked. His emails were copied. Evelyn's house was broken into, though nothing was taken. She later found a small listening device hidden under her kitchen counter. Whoever was watching them wasn't trying to stop them, but they were clearly interested. And then something extraordinary happened. At 3:19 a.m. on June 11, 2024, Ryan received an alert from one of his simulation systems. It had begun to run again on its own. No manual input. The simulation loaded the 1945 weather data, the flight path, and the radio logs. He watched as the virtual Flight 19 entered the anomaly zone. Only this time, the model didn't stop at the disappearance. Kept going. It showed the planes ascending, not descending, into a space filled with static and mist. The coordinates looped, repeating like a spiral. And then, briefly, just before the model crashed, a line of text appeared on screen. Flight 19 maintains formation. Conditions non-linear. That wasn't part of any pre-programmed output. Ryan stood frozen in front of the screen, his pulse pounding. It was like the simulation had become self-aware, like it had accessed something beyond code. He copied everything to an external drive and called Evelyn. But when he drove to her home that morning, her car was still in the driveway and the front door was wide open. Evelyn was gone. Her files were gone. Only the photos remained on her desk. Ryan reported her disappearance to the police, but they found no sign of struggle. No sign she had packed a bag or left willingly. She had simply vanished. Like the others. Now alone, Ryan returned to the last coordinates the simulation produced. They pointed to a specific area in the Atlantic, 120 miles northeast of the Bahamas. He contacted a small charter boat company, paid in cash, and set off with 2 crew members under the guise of oceanographic study. 3 days into the trip, as the sun dipped low, they reached the coordinates. The sea was calm. No signs of storms or interference. But then, every compass on the boat began to spin. The GPS flickered, then died. One of the crewmen reported a strange sound below deck, a low hum, like metal resonating under pressure. And then they saw it. A shimmer on the water. Not a reflection. Not mist. Something shimmering above the surface like heat rising from asphalt, except it had shape, texture. It pulsed, then began to move. Before anyone could react, the boat's engine failed. Radios died. The water turned eerily still. Ryan stood at the bow, gripping the railing, eyes locked on the shimmering mass just a few yards away. He could feel something. Not fear. Recognition. As if some part of him had been here before. And then, just as suddenly, the shimmer disappeared. The instruments came back online. The engine restarted. But something had changed in the air. Ryan checked the GPS. They were no longer at the coordinates. They were 80 miles west, instantly. The crew was shaken but unharmed. Ryan said nothing on the trip back. He reviewed the data repeatedly, but the logs were scrambled, as if time had folded briefly and unspooled. He didn't go public with what happened. Not immediately. But something told him Flight 19 never crashed. Something told him it's still out there. Flying. Waiting. Caught in a loop between time, tide, and something else entirely. Something we weren't meant to understand. Frank sat in silence aboard the newly restored Avenger. His fingers clenched tight around the edge of his seat as the aircraft soared above the Atlantic. The sky was cloudless this time, unusually clear, as if beckoning them forward. Commander Hughes, sitting in the pilot's seat, looked over his shoulder and gave a reassuring nod. We're closing in on the last recorded coordinates. Everyone stay alert. The hum of the engine was steady, yet tension crackled in the cabin like static. With Frank was a carefully selected team. Eleanor Bishop, the aviation historian who had led the museum's research, Tony Wexler, a former Navy technician, and Marie, a skeptical journalist who had insisted on documenting the return mission. They had tracked everything. The old radio logs, compass anomalies, declassified files. And now, in this vintage bird, they were flying straight into the same airspace where 5 Navy bombers had disappeared decades ago. As they passed over the 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west mark, the instruments began to flicker. Frank looked up from his notes. "It's happening," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. Tony leaned over the dashboard, tapping at the compass that now spun erratically. Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. "This is consistent with what the surviving transmissions reported in 45. Frank, remember what Taylor said. Everything looks wrong, even the ocean." Marie, clutching her camera, leaned toward the cockpit window. "It's starting to feel like that now," she said, her voice tight with awe and unease. "Look at the horizon." And then it happened again. The blue sky ahead of them shimmered, a subtle distortion like heat over asphalt. The aircraft jerked slightly, not due to turbulence, but something else entirely. It was as if space itself had shifted, folded in some imperceptible way. Hughes steadied the controls, but his face had gone pale. The communications radio squawked violently with static, then a garbled voice came through. "This is Flight 19, position unclear, can't see land." The cabin went completely still. "That can't be a recording," Tony said, scanning the dials. "There's no tape in this system. It's all analog." Frank leaned forward. "That's Taylor. That's Charles Taylor. I've memorized his voice from the tapes." Eleanor's hand trembled as she clutched a map. "We're hearing them in real time, from the past?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. As the aircraft pushed forward, the visibility began to change. A fog materialized seemingly from nowhere, thick and silver gray. Everything around them was suddenly quiet, the hum of the engine dampened as though underwater. And then they saw it. Below them was a ghostly armada. 5 aircraft in near-perfect formation, floating just above the water's surface but not moving. The paint on them was fresh. No corrosion, no sign of age. Hughes circled around slowly. "My God, it's them," he whispered. Marie was snapping pictures furiously, but even her lens fogged with each shot. The images came out blurry and distorted. "These planes," Frank said, "they're not wreckage. They're preserved. Like something's keeping them here." Tony noticed something else. On the radar they were now no longer over water. "This isn't the Atlantic anymore. There's no seabed. It's just depth. Like the ocean goes on forever." Suddenly the radios flared again. "This is Taylor. We can't see the sun. Everything's white. We're not sure which way is west. Fuel is low. We may have to ditch." The voice was so clear it sounded like he was in the seat beside them. Marie clutched her headphones, visibly shaking. "We've crossed into some pocket of time," Eleanor whispered. "A fold in reality, maybe. But these men, they're trapped. It's not just missing planes. It's missing time." Hughes tried to navigate them back, banking the aircraft away from the fog. But it clung to them, dense and alive, dragging their visibility to zero. Alarms sounded on the dash. Tony shouted, "We're losing altitude." Hughes pulled the yoke, but it felt like dragging it through wet cement. Then, as if something snapped, the plane was flung upward violently. For a second there was weightlessness, and then nothing but black. When Frank came to, they were on the water. The Avenger was floating, somehow intact, but the world around them was dead calm. The fog had lifted, and the sky was a deep amber. Eleanor was the first to speak. "Where are we?" Hughes looked at his instruments. Everything was frozen. No readings, no compass, no GPS. Tony opened the side hatch and gasped. There, floating nearby in complete silence, was one of the Flight 19 planes, bobbing like a lifeless puppet. Its cockpit was open. A pilot still sat inside, unmoving but preserved, eyes wide as if locked in terror or awe. Frank approached, his heart hammering. "Captain Taylor," he whispered. No answer. But then, as if reacting to his voice, the pilot blinked. Just once. "He's alive," Eleanor gasped. "They're all alive. Somehow." Marie began filming again, tears in her eyes. This is something beyond science, beyond reason. And yet they all felt it. A hum in the air, a presence watching. Something didn't want them there. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the sky. Hughes screamed, "We've got to go now." They scrambled back into the Avenger and fired the engines. As they lifted off, the ocean below twisted, rippling like a living surface. The fog returned instantly, enveloping them in a blinding white cocoon. Time seemed to collapse again. The voice of Taylor echoed, not from the radio this time, but from inside Frank's mind. "We never left. We never left." When they broke through the clouds, they were flying over Florida. The coast stretched below them like nothing had happened. No fog. No distortion. No sun. The date on the dash flickered, then stabilized. December 5, 1945. Marie screamed, "That's impossible." Hughes adjusted the frequency to modern channels. Nothing. Only World War II-era broadcast signals filled the speakers. They had gone too far in. Or perhaps never returned at all. Frank looked out the window, his voice hollow. "We're not in the present anymore. We've become part of the story now. Just like them." The radio buzzed again, but this time with a voice none of them recognized. It wasn't from the past. It wasn't from their own time either. It was mechanical, monotone, like a distorted human impression. Unauthorized presence. Recalibration in progress. Temporal anomaly detected. Extraction initiated. The voice cut off with a hiss, followed by silence. Inside the cockpit, Commander Hughes stared at the controls. The dials spun out of sync, lights flashing randomly. The horizon outside had turned pitch black, although it was only midday a moment ago. A sickening shift pulled at their stomachs, like they were falling while standing still. Tony braced against the bulkhead. "We're not in 1945 anymore," he said hoarsely. "We're in something else entirely. Some kind of holding space." Eleanor was crying silently, gripping the side of her seat. What if this isn't the Bermuda Triangle at all? What if this is a prison? A vault that collects people who get too close to the truth? Frank was quiet. He remembered all the accounts from years of research, all the planes, ships, and people that had vanished without a trace. Now it made a twisted kind of sense. Maybe it doesn't just take you. Maybe it learns from you, studies you, keeps you just on the edge of life and time. Outside the window, glowing shapes flickered in and out of the darkness. Triangular silhouettes, silent and smooth, unlike anything man-made. They didn't move like aircraft or birds. They hovered, blinking in and out of visibility. Marie fumbled with her camera, but the lens remained dark. "No matter what I do, I can't capture them," she whispered. "It's like they're not supposed to be seen." The plane jolted. A voice returned, closer this time. It was Taylor again, Only now he sounded clearer than ever, as if standing just behind them. You shouldn't have come. You brought it back. It feeds on curiosity. Frank spun around looking for the source. Nothing was there. Brought what back? He yelled. No response came. Only a deep hum began to grow around them, vibrating through the fuselage. Hughes was fighting the controls. Something's trying to take control of the aircraft. They were no longer in charge of the mission. The plane banked hard to the left, heading downward toward a circle of water that began to glow in impossible colors, purples and greens that pulsed like breathing tissue. Eleanor reached for Frank. We need to eject. We need to. But it was too late. The Avenger plunged downward in a spiral, sucked into the glowing vortex. None of them screamed. There was no time. Just an overwhelming silence, followed by a blinding white flash. Frank awoke to the sound of soft waves and gulls in the distance. He was lying on a beach. Alone. The air was warm, the sky clear. No fog. No hum. Just peace. For a few minutes, he thought he had hallucinated the entire ordeal. But when he sat up, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. On the sand next to him was Eleanor's notebook, its pages soaked but still legible. Scribbled across one page was a phrase. We crossed through. But not all of us came back. He stood and looked around. No Avenger. No Marie. No Hughes. No Tony. Only sand, sea, and jungle beyond. In the distance, he spotted a rusted sign barely sticking out of the brush. He staggered toward it, his feet sinking into the soft sand. The sign read, Naval Air Station. Established 1944. And beneath it another, restricted. Decommissioned. Frank walked further inland, the eerie realization dawning that he wasn't just lost geographically. He was lost in time. Everything looked dated. The vehicles were from the 1950s. There were no signs of modern civilization. And when he finally reached a road and flagged down an old truck, the driver stared at him in confusion. You okay, mister? You look like you've seen a ghost. Frank couldn't find the words. What year is it? He finally managed to ask. The driver raised an eyebrow. 1956, he said. Why? Frank leaned back in the seat, trembling. Years. He'd gone back, but not to the right place or the right time. He was part of the mystery now. Another chapter in the story he'd spent his life investigating. The truck drove off down a long, empty road, leaving behind the beach and the impossible journey he'd survived. Years passed. In 2025, a team of divers exploring a newly revealed reef in the Atlantic stumbled upon a series of aircraft wrecks perfectly preserved at the ocean floor, planes that matched the serial numbers of Flight 19. Among the wreckage, a waterproof container was recovered. Inside were photos taken by Marie, distorted but undeniably modern. The military seized the findings within days. Some say Frank eventually returned. Others believe he still wanders the coastline, slipping in and out of time like the ghosts he once chased. The Bermuda Triangle never gave up its secrets easily. But every now and then, a voice would come through on old static-filled frequencies, calling out a single message. This is Flight 19, position unclear. Everything looks strange. We're not sure we'll ever make it home. And in the deep, endless hum of the triangle, something always listens.